in case we flub any of those transitions in terms of how smoothly they go. So welcome everybody to the 2021 Invasive Forest Pest Webinar Series. This series has been organized by the Nature Conservancy and the Entomological Society of America as a way to communicate across a lot of different partners and organizations, individuals, researchers, and policy specialists in support of two different multi-stakeholder initiatives by those two respective organizations, which are the Nature Conservancy's Continental Dialogue on non-native forest insects and diseases, as well as the Entomological Society of America's Grand Challenges Agenda for Entomology. So both of those two institutions I just mentioned prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic were primarily conducted through in-person meetings. And so we're taking this time at the end of the year in order to try to sort of reconvene lots of different people in the course of the last 4 webinars in order to chart a course forward into 2022 and beyond. Our webinar leaders for today, in order to keep the conversation and the logistics going, will be, as you see on the screen, myself, Lee Greenwood. I am the Forest Health Program Director for the Nature Conservancy, and I am the point person for all things forest pests and pathogens within the global nonprofit, the Nature Conservancy, which in my case, my jurisdiction is with North American forests and trees, but we do have initiatives across the world. Helping me out in case I need it today is the point person for the Grand Challenges and Agenda in Entomology, Erin Cadwallader, the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Entomological Society of America. And Erin, if you could give yourself just the briefest of intros so that everybody can see you, that would be great.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Lee. My name is Erin Cadwallader, as Lee said, and as part of my job, I oversee the Grand Challenges Agenda for Entomology. This is an initiative that started in roughly 2014 with sort of the vision of bringing together entomological societies from across the globe to address the big challenges facing the intersection of arthropods and human suffering. And invasive species happens to be one of those places where we've seen an opportunity to engage. We again miss meeting people in person, and given challenges, and that our next meeting will be in Vancouver in November of 2022, we'll be looking forward to trying to host our next in-person event, pandemics willing, in November of 2023 in National Harbor outside of Washington, D.C. So hopefully we look forward to seeing many of you then. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and to clarify for everybody in case they got a little lost. So the 2022 meeting in Vancouver will be in person, but we will not have an explicit session for the Grand Challenges Agenda for Entomology because it's difficult to convene all the different parties in Canada when a lot of them are US government employees. So instead, the explicit session for the Grand Challenges Agenda will be at the following meeting, which will be just outside DC. Very convenient for anybody involved in the US government sector. So to seek help, you have a couple options here. Number one, if you'd like to take yourself off of mute because you need to state a question verbally in the course of the Q&A section, please reach out to one of our folks helping run the call, which is Laurel Downs. You should see her name in the chat menu and just say, Laurel, please take me off mute, and she will go ahead and do that. She's got a button where she can take care of you. Now, if you have a different type of question or comment that pertains more to sort of like the tech or accessibility of this webinar, please reach out directly to Giovanna Johnson, who was the one who just gave you the introduction on the Entomological Society of America's other meetings and so forth for the next year. She is also available via chat. Just find her name in the chat menu and send her a quick message if you're having an issue that you think she could help with. Now, as just a friendly reminder for everybody, we will be recording all of these webinars. This is the last one in the series, but there's 3 prior, and posting both the recordings and the slide decks in a PDF format for every single one of the presentations that we've been doing. And those recordings and slide deck links will be put all on one page at continentalforestdialogue.org, and they are being hosted by the Entomological Society of America's YouTube channel. So thank you, ESA, for hosting those recordings on your channel. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to describe why we had 4 webinars in the first place. So the Continental Dialogue, which is the multi-stakeholder group that I convene, uses a conceptual, is in the process of creating a strategic plan. And in order to do so, we have been using a conceptual framework to define the scope of forest pests across North America in order to fulfill our mission, which includes the statement that we will abate the threat of forest pests and pathogens across North America. And that conceptual framework that we've been using is defined as 5 different categories, starting overseas or over large land masses, in the prevention category of how invasive species reach North American forests, and then proceeds sort of forward in time, although all of these divisions are fuzzy. This is conceptual, it's not concrete, through early detection and arrival, which we did a webinar on last week, as well as initial establishment and management and early and ongoing infestations before they have reached the sort of the status where they are considered naturalized in the environment. And then finally, the management of pests that have been functionally naturalized across large swaths of North American forests. And today what we'll be discussing is this last one. So when we reach a point where a non-native insect or disease has a very large range and is becoming a part of that ecosystem, whether we would like it to or not, it has essentially, in shorthand, become a naturalized invader. Now that's a tricky place to be because in some cases that means the invader can or will cause the functional extinction of a tree species or even genus. So we need to actively manage at a very large scale. And in order to actively manage at a very large scale, you have to stop focusing everything on the pest and start looking at things through the lens of trees. And that brings us to our theme today, which is the invasive forest pest webinar through the lens of trees. So here's your schedule today that we'll be talking about it from the lens of trees themselves, not the forest pests. First speaker will be Carolyn Pike, who I'll introduce in a moment, who will be talking about resistance breeding with the U.S. Forest Service. Then we're going to have a discussion of that and then follow up with a talk from Sarah Fitzsimmons with the American Chestnut Foundation talking about chestnut trees and chestnut blight. And then we're going to broaden our scope even a little bit further and talk with Katie Barlow with the Nature Conservancy, who is the author of a recent document called Managing for Climate Resilience that covers both forest pests as one of many threats to the future of eastern forests in particular from a climate resilience standpoint. So she's going to really open up the conversation to incorporate a number of different topics outside of even the pest perspective. So we're looking right on time at 10 after the hour. So I am going to just take one moment to say thank you all for participating. We had 50 registrants for this webinar, and it looks like right now we have 33 participants. So hopefully a few more people will be able to jump on pretty soon. We really appreciate all of our funding agencies. The work that I do is primarily funded by the U.S. Forest Service and USDA APHIS, and we really appreciate their support of this incredibly important partnership work. And just a reminder, please type your questions or comments during the course of the presentation into either the chat or the question and answer box. I will read them out loud at the end of the formal presentation period, regardless of where I find them. And remember, if you'd like to be taken off mute so you can just ask your question verbally, please ask Laurel or Giovanna if necessary. So I am here to welcome Dr. Carolyn Pike, Forest Regeneration Specialist with the Reforestation, Nurseries, and Genetic Resources Group of the U.S. Forest Service Eastern Region. And Carrie is going to be talking about her resistance breeding work at large. So Carrie, I will close my screen. And that should allow you to share yours.
Yep.
And
how's that?
That looks great. I'm going to put myself on mute, but I could hear you fine.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Lee. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Pike. I am with the Eastern Region, State and Private Forestry, and I am based in West Lafayette, Indiana. And I am the program lead for the Ringer program in the Eastern Region. Eastern Region is also called Region 9. And Ringer stands for Reforestation, Nurseries, and Genetic Resources. If we were in person, I would be handing out I Love Baby Trees stickers and buttons that have our website on it, ringer.net. And the Intertribal Nursery Council is also part of Ringer. I have a colleague who works nationally with all the tribes on nursery issues. And I'm in West Lafayette, Indiana at Purdue, and I'm based with the Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center. So it's a little bit about me. I am going to be talking about reforestation. I'm going to be talking about resistance breeding from a Ringer standpoint, really kind of an overview of host resistance breeding, kind of from the tree perspective. So what is resistance breeding? I think it's important to define our terms first. This is an iterative process. It involves selection, testing, and most importantly, breeding to improve the trait of interest. And in this case, it's resistance. This is sort of a classical tree improvement type of program. The goal is to produce seed that has improved resistance, but most importantly, is also genetically diverse and adapted to conditions at employment. We are not looking necessarily for clones or cultivars, although clones and cultivars may be part of like an outcome of the program, but given climate change, we need sources that are going to be resilient for future climates as well. And so we have to do this, we do this with genetic diversity. So I'm going to describe this model. It's not the same model for every species. The model I'm describing is the one that sort of works for emerald ash borer. There are 4 steps. First is finding these surviving trees. And again, this is like an early wave novel pest or pathogen like EAB. It's finding those survivor trees, capturing the material. And then it's challenge screening them to determine if they actually have resistance or if they are an escape. And then you want to breed them. And this is really important because it allows us to accelerate natural selection and then select those progeny with the best resistance and develop seed orchards for reforestation. And what I'm going to do today, though, I'm going to kind of go over these steps, but really the emphasis is like what the partners can do and what the Forest Service is able to do. So step 1, finding these surviving trees. Surviving trees that we do find for something like emerald ash borer are not really going to be resistant. They might have some genes for resistance, but they're not going to be resistant. How do we know if they have resistance? We need to get that material to a lab or a clone bank, for example, if you can graft them. And we need to screen them with some kind of protocol that includes a resistant and susceptible standard so we can rate them essentially. This can sometimes for different species, we are in different stages of this program. We may know they're resistant taxa, there may not be. So this can vary by taxa. But what's also important especially for our partners to understand, because they're going to be really critical in helping us to find these trees, is that these attributes of a lingering surviving tree are going to vary by species. So trees that survive a novel pest like emerald ash borer, they're going to have some genes for resistance, but they're going to be pretty highly susceptible still. So what does a lingering tree look like? It may show lower levels of attack or disease than its neighbors. It may also live a little bit longer than susceptible trees, but it may eventually die. That doesn't mean, oh, well, we lost. It just means that maybe the resistance mechanism was having it live a little bit longer. I think it's really important, though, we don't want to set the bar too high on these trees. Resistance is easily masked by other environmental factors. So this picture on the right is from my colleague, Linda Haugen. It's a surviving elm. And the difference with like emerald ash borer, which is a novel pest, versus elm and Dutch elm disease, which has been around for 50 years, is that in elm, there's already been some natural selection. And so some of these bigger trees on the landscape have survived and endured, and those are the ones we're targeting. But your lingering ash tree is not going to necessarily be this big, beautiful tree. They're going to look a little bit more damaged by emerald ash borer. So the genetics part of this, and something geneticists have seen through research, is that the genes for resistance to these novel pests, if they exist, are going to be scattered across the landscape. And that's this little cartoon on the left. The reason is trees are, and this is what we've confirmed through lots of population genetic studies, trees are outstanding at outcrossing. at getting seeds and seed and pollen dispersed across the landscape. They're very good at that. So for this reason, when you don't have natural selection to kind of shape these populations and to narrow them down, you end up with just a random mishmash of genes that are everywhere. After a few decades of natural selection, like with Dutch elm disease, you may start to find some of these pockets of resistance, but for the most part, they're going to be really pretty well distributed across the landscape. So the first part, finding those lingering trees, really involves scouring the landscape because they're going to be perfectly scattered around. But when it comes to the actual, like, let's develop a standardized protocol, this is where it's very science heavy. So this is dependent on Forest Service researchers. This is also dependent on university researchers. They have a role in this as well. So I'm showing you different pictures of how this can look. For butternut canker on the bottom left, this one has been a loser. We drill a hole in the stem and insert the inoculum. We don't think this is the right way to screen these. We're not doing well with butternut canker. Beech bark disease, though, it's worked. So you can, Jennifer Cook with the Northern Research Station developed a protocol. You can screen them pretty quickly and easily. The picture on the top right is emerald ash borer screening protocol. And they take eggs, they put them in coffee filters, and they tape them onto the tree and let them work. With hemlock woolly adelgid and white pine blister rust disease, it's more of a passive inoculation. The white pine blister rust disease, you can see there you have infected European ribes leaves, spore side down, and they're allowed to passively rain down on the seedlings. With hemlock woolly adelgid, they get early stage insects, and they allow them to passively inoculate the seedlings underneath them. This part of the process is really hard. In addition to having a resistant and susceptible standard, this is the bottleneck often in these programs. The next step, though, is really important too, and this can be done by partners or by scientists. Really, anybody can do tree breeding. You have to use these controlled pollinations, in this case, to cross lingering trees, those that you've screened and you've determined have some resistance traits. So this is really the same for any taxa. It can be more difficult to do on others. So the tree on the far left is a natural forest. Obviously, somebody had a very tall lift to get those pollination bags on. And so the pollen bags you can see on the top right, I sometimes like to call them plant condoms just to get a laugh, but it's an isolation bag. And so you put it on the branch with the flowers in there isolated before the flowers emerge. Keep other pollen out, you stick your pollen in the bag. And so this particular brand of bags has this clear plastic window. So it's really neat. If you're lucky though, as you can see in this one, this is a red pine breeding program. We're on the ground. Sometimes you can do this in potted orchards in the lab, and that's great when you can do that. And sometimes, again, you're on in a field planted seed orchard on a lift. But regardless of the taxa, the concept is the same. Breeding is important because it allows you to combine the genes from each parent. This is a schematic that Jennifer Cook uses. So you might have a lingering ash tree on one forest that maybe has a couple of alleles. So those pluses are alleles. And on another tree in another forest only has one allele. And they don't look that spectacular. But if you cross them together, you get a bunch of progeny, and then you screen those. And what you're going to find is that the genes are going to segregate out. You're going to get some trees on the bottom right that have absolutely zero resistance. They're horrible. You're going to get some in the middle that are going to look like both the parents. And then you're going to get some that look better than the parents. And those are the ones that you need to target. Each generation you do this, you can get more improvement. Just depends how much money you have and how long you want to run your program. But we do rely on natural selection to finish the job off on a lot of these because we just don't have the resources. So the step 4 is that you want to graft the best individuals into a second generation orchard. So if you have 100 lingering trees, you make 50 crosses, you collect the seed from each cross, hopefully have a good maybe 50 or 100 seedlings from each cross, and you select. So you have to run that screening protocol twice in this case. That second run will allow you to pick out these winners. You put them to a second generation grafted orchard, and maybe that's where you stop, or maybe you can continue further depending on what your resources are. But what I want to impress upon you is that resistance is not an on-off switch. It's not a binary thing. It is, in fact, quantitative. There's usually a lot of genes involved. So I think of resistance as a ladder. The bottom of the ladder is 100% susceptible. So your susceptible host, that ash that gets wiped away right away from EAB is the bottom rung. The top rung might be Manchurian ash, something that's has complete immunity. And for all intents and purposes, it's just not a practical goal for us. You can't even imagine getting there for most of our taxa. That lingering tree, though, is going to be a little bit better than the host. So you've gone up a rung on the ladder. And the whole objective of these resistance breeding programs is simply to elevate resistance so that the trees may survive and reproduce. So that second generation orchard will get you part way up. It won't get you all the way up. Each generation, though, you can eke it up further. So here's the thing. I mean, you walk around the forest, you see all the hemlock dying, you see all the ash dying. We are not going to be able to replace every single tree with a resistant tree from a breeding program. It's not practical. But what we can do, if we can develop seedlings that have better than average resistance, we've stacked some of the genes, we can plant them strategically in the forest or in seed orchards and they will become seed trees for the future. Natural selection will do the rest of the job for us. So if we think of it like that, it becomes a little bit more of a manageable cause. Unfortunately, though, nature doesn't always cooperate with us. For example, resistance in butternut has completely evaded us. I was just at a meeting about butternut here at Purdue. We're trying to move the needle on butternut canker, and it's going to take a village. We have had success, though, in other systems. White pine blister us. We have made great strides. Port Orford cedar has Phytophthora lateralis. Acacia koa wilt. We got lucky break with acacia koa wilt. And beech bark disease has worked. And new advances with emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid are all very promising. Most importantly, though, for you folks who are on this webinar, we cannot do this without partnerships. You cannot rely on the Forest Service to execute this entire pipeline in the eastern US, because more than half of our forest land is managed by state and private entities. So we need your help. One of the best partners and the folks that I work with mostly in my job with Ringer is the state nurseries. They often have land for seed orchards. They often have space for grafting, and many of them have seed plants so they can process seeds. Some of them even have greenhouses, and most of them have shade houses. And unfortunately, as you can see from the graph, many of them have closed permanently. Those are the red dots. The green dots are the open nurseries. More recently, we lost the nursery in West Virginia closed. That's the red X in West Virginia, and Michigan's nursery is mostly closed in the UP. On the plus side, there is a Forest Service nursery in Toomey Nursery in Michigan is the green plus sign in the northern one, and the southern one is the Oconto River Seed Orchard in Wisconsin. And then we have a resistance screening center in Asheville, North Carolina that can do a fair bit of screening, mostly for fusiform rust, but they can work on other systems as well with funding. So seed orchards are the primary means for disseminating these products. Anybody can host a seed orchard. The eastern white pine on the bottom left, those are approved for blister rust disease. It's only first generation, but it's better than nothing. That's at Minnesota at one of the state nurseries. The beech bark disease resistant seed orchard on the right is with Michigan State University. And that seed will go out to Michigan State and with the state as well as the university. So the role of partners is really important. This initial research phase, which is like, developing the protocols, figuring out if resistance exists, how we measure it, how it's inherited, determining methods to survey, screen, and propagate trees, that falls largely on university and research partners and Forest Service research a lot. Technology transfer, though, once these are developed, these can go to our partners so that they can help us survey, they can identify lingering trees, and in some cases, we can make the resistance testing portable. Also, we want to teach our partners how to propagate trees so that we can have hubs of them around the landscape. The operational phase is really mostly partners. Research doesn't need to participate. Establishing seed orchard, producing seeds with resistance, and planting them. So this is showing the American Beech Improvement Partner roles. So this is Jennifer Cook's work. So on the left-hand side, state and NFS partners, that's National Forest System. They survey, they field test, they collect scion. The grafting happens at the National Forest System or at the Northern Research Station. Holden Forest and Gardens is also participating actively. I'll describe that program in a minute. And then there are regional seed orchards in partnership with state and national forests. There's one in Indiana, 2 in Michigan, 2 in Pennsylvania, and 1 in West Virginia Then the state and the national forest system nurseries germinate the seed and outplant the seedlings. So this is one pipeline that works well for American beech. Recently, we established a Great Lakes Basin Forest Health Collaborative, which was established in 2020. It is funded through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It is based at Holden Forests and Gardens Arboretum in Ohio. They're working with American beech, ash, and eastern hemlock, and their objective is to provide training for partners. Dr. Rachel Kapler is a coordinator. She serves as a liaison among partners of the collaborative. So her job is to train partners in how to locate lingering ash trees, how to graft survivors, and how to develop seed orchards. So she hosts workshops, webinars, and trainings. Limited to the Great Lakes Basin, our goal is to replicate this model to serve other parts of the Eastern region, like New York, New England, and the Lake States. So the website is there, and that's Rachel's contact information. So this is my last slide. Thank you for listening. Resistance screening is a team effort. It will take a community of partners to be successful. And I just want to thank my colleagues at the Northern Research Station for providing slides of their work. Linda Haugen with State and Private, Rachel Kapler for photos, and Sean Hoban has provided me these butternut photos that have gotten quite a bit of use. So thank you all.
Thanks, Carrie. That was outstanding and really impactful to see all the steps in the process and how it's coming together for different species. I think we forget sometimes that, we all get locked up into one species, but it's so many of them. And I think your program really speaks to that. So what I'm going to do is do my best to do the questions that came up in the chat in the order they were offered up. And I will read them out because I know that not everybody can always see the chat at all, or just even see it very well. So one moment, let me find the first good question. The first good question is a comment, which is everybody loves your baby tree stickers. People who really feel called to them, free to email you and request one. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, I can send those out.
So if you would be so kind, Carrie, to put the email you would prefer into the chat for folks to request a baby tree sticker, I think that by popular demand would be a great move. Okay, so that's not really a question, but I saw there was a moment there. Okay. Jeremy Zagarella asks, why are we closing so many state nurseries across the United States as shown on your map?
It's complicated. They all have different reasons. There was actually a survey that was just completed on all the state nurseries across the US that identified some of these reasons, although there was a survey in 2016 as well. The reasons they cite, some of it's competition. Private nurseries do not necessarily want a state nursery. They view it as their competition. And so they will pressure the governor, and it doesn't take a lot of pressure to get them to close their state nursery. A lot of it's budget constraints. They have a tight budget year and they just say, oh, we don't need these nurseries, and they cut them off. I won't say which state did that, but one of the states in the South did that. So it's competition, budgets. I mean, those are the two main ones. Sometimes it's markets. So the West Virginia nursery had a really hard time finding markets. So they had a hard time covering their costs. And so it was just more and more expensive for the state to support them, and they just decided they couldn't afford it anymore. So it's a variety of factors, but a lot of them point to budget. It's also political. Somebody just, and it mainly goes down to somebody just says, we shouldn't be competing with private nurseries. And then it just takes even when they're covering their bases and they're okay financially, they may not want that. So those are the main factors.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining those different factors that go into that decision. Let me pull up the next question. Margaret Allen asks, how is the success of seed orchards impacted by soil quarantines?
I don't know what soil quarantines are.
There are many federal soil quarantines for things like red imported fire ant, the different Phytophthora. I mean, do you see it? I mean, the fact that you hadn't thought about that sounds to me like it hasn't been terribly impactful yet.
Not really, no, because generally our seed orchards, you bring the material to a site, you pop it into the ground. Their soil isn't necessarily moved around. And in labs, they're going to use sterilized soil. So that hasn't been an issue. Maybe an issue in the southern US where they have a lot of seed orchards, but I haven't heard about that in the north.
Okay, so maybe that's something that we could make sure will continue to not be very impactful, but not.
Hopefully not.
Okay, great. Gary Fish inquires, have you done any work with new breeding techniques? Gary, can you type in, or if we need to take you off chat, do you mean genetic resources such as Sarah Fitzsimmons is going to cover for American chestnut, or do you have a different intent when you said new breeding techniques? Oh, Gary, if you'd like to take yourself off mute, you should be able to now. There you go.
Sure, yeah, I just mean genetic engineering, CRISPR, whatever.
Okay, Carrie.
Yeah, so the genetic engineering, so here's the problem. We have so many taxa that are influenced, and to use any of these genetic engineering techniques means you have to have a fair bit of all of these genomes sequenced. And so for like a species like butternut, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of resources to do the pre-work that you need to be able to put genetic engineering to work. Now, in some systems, like, so Sarah's going to talk about she's going to talk about chestnut. We've done a lot of work with chestnut since we've been working on this for so long. And so the genome has been sequenced. There's a lot that we know about chestnut, so we can build off of that work. But with like butternut, I mean, we can build off of other walnut genomes, but there's just not a lot known. And when you start bringing in another pest, it's like another genome that needs to be sequenced. It's more pre-work that needs to be done. And so it takes time to get all those pieces in order. The hardest thing is figuring out how to associate a particular trait with a particular gene. And that's the gold standard. That's what we want. We would love to be able to pick up a leaf and say, is this tree resistant based on its DNA? It takes so much money and effort to get to that point that it's not even practical. By the time you get there, the species is gone. So we have to implore, we do a little bit better, like the basic breeding and selection that we're doing, we can do now, it's cheap, it doesn't take millions of dollars in work. And so that's the starting point. If we can continue doing genome sequencing and save the species, maybe 20 years for some of these species, maybe we can utilize some CRISPR and some other technologies. But it is, and it's getting easier and it's getting less expensive. But in a pinch, like when you're starting with a species like butternut and there's no money, it's a scramble. It's a scramble. So it requires a lot of pre-work. And again, with chestnut, the Chestnut Foundation, God bless them, has built this up over so many years. We've got a lot of work, all that pre-work done. But we don't have it with butternut. We're trying to get it with ash. And eventually these tools will be helpful, but without them, like, we still have to keep working.
So Gary, what I hear is that, it's one of the tools, but because it is one of the most complex, difficult, expensive, long-term tools, if you can achieve your ends with older tools, then by all means, that's preferable in terms of time to deployment and finances and feasibility and so forth. And also, I don't know if Sarah will get into this, but also the public acceptance of your final product does come into play when you talk about, traditional breeding versus genetic technique-based breeding. There's a difference in public perception there.
Yeah, there's a big difference. And I think the public will come around to it, but GMOs had such a bad rep in the 90s that's something that, that's something to overcome. I think though the public is coming around to say, you know what, if you need to do this to save the species, great. If you're doing it to make money, maybe not good. So the perception is definitely an issue. But yeah, I'd love to continue for species like butternut. We're working with Canadians. They have done a lot of this molecular pre-work. They have a system that's almost ready to help us genotype, at least to figure out if it's Juglans cinerea or Juglans cinerea atlantifolia cross. It's a weird thing with butternut. So yeah, it's a great question. It's something we'd love to do, and we will continue to work on that. But in the meantime, we end up in these time scrambles and money scrambles, and it's cheaper and easy to do some of these other routes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. That was a great answer. Okay, I'm looking in the chat. Algire, I'm sorry, Tom, I don't know how to say your name. Says, golden nematode is also a soil quarantine pest. That's a great point. And just on the note of moving soil, there's also the question of, is there consideration for Asian jumping worm, which is a new invasive species of soil that's increasingly problematic in the greater Midwestern states, as I recall, specifically the cysts, which are kind of like eggs, I guess. So, is this an issue that you've been working with, Caroline?
I haven't
Yeah.
run across that. And again, part of the advantage of having regional hubs means that we don't have to move stuff as far. And so if we can set up regional hubs and just move plant material, even just in its roots, or if we're moving plant material that's in pots with sterile soil, then we don't have the issues, and you put it into, a site and we're not moving material around as much. So ideally we have more of these regional hubs, but mostly we're either moving grafts, which are usually created in a lab in sterile soil, and those get planted into sea orchards.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and I mean the part of the answer is you don't have to put into deeper consideration all the specific soil quarantines if you have so many regional hubs that you wouldn't be crossing a quarantine line, wouldn't be posing that risk. And so that's the point for the importance of regional hubs, is that you actually eliminate some of your problems right in the structure of your program.
Yes.
Okay, outstanding. Herb Bolton with the USDA APHIS would like to ask, Carrie, can you please speak to the work that the Forest Service is doing on understanding the molecular basis of ash tree resistance?
Yeah, so Jennifer Cook is working on this. She's doing this in a partnership, I'm going to say Penn State. There's a bunch of folks who are molecular geneticists. Jennifer kind of is both a molecular and more trained in molecular, but she's also a tree breeder. And so her research straddles both of those worlds. Yes, we are working towards, there's a couple of ways of working on ash. One of them is looking at the metabolomic profile. And so that's not so much molecular, but it's the volatiles that are coming off of them. So there is work being done on that. They're also looking at doing more sequencing and identifying the genes that could be identified and used to select. So if we can find some genes, they are working towards this because ash is a time issue. They're working towards being able to identify, at least have a SNP panel. I think they're working towards a SNP panel in ash to try to figure out what SNPs are related to resistance and which ones aren't. So I think Jennifer Cook is working towards that. She's got partners, I believe, at Penn State. She was working with Jean Romero-Severson at Notre Dame as well. So that is an effort that's moving forward. So
I have two questions to follow up because ash is very near and dear to my heart. Number one, remind us all, please, we're bug people. What's a SNP?
Sorry. Single nucleotide polymorphism. When you get into the molecular genetics literature, it's just brutal. So it's just a way you look across the genome of like multiple trees, you like line them up like an Excel spreadsheet. They're going to be the same everywhere. And then where they're different, boop, there's your SNP. Where it's different, oh, there's another one. And they identify these areas, and those tell you where there's variation in the genome that might be neutral and it might be attributed to a trait. And if you get a couple of million of them, then you can start associating them with traits. So it's
like markers.
They're like markers, but you find millions. They try to find millions of them because you've got genomes. Tree genomes are really, really big, and so you try to get as much of the coverage of that billions of base pairs as possible. So the more, so those SNPs are it's just a little alteration in the DNA where there's a flip from one individual to the next. It's not a conserved base pair. And that means there's something going on there, or maybe it's just a fluke. And then you use enough of them and you can sort out the ones that are meaningful and the ones that aren't meaningful.
Okay, so when you have big tree data, you can use them.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can get a whole bunch of SNPs they're getting easier and cheaper to do. You can find a whole bunch of SNPs, and then if you can associate them with the trait, I mean, it ends up being really big data sets, but it's doable for some.
That's awesome. Okay, well, thank you for that one because I was a little lost there. And then also you just said ash has a time issue. Are you referring to the fact that we're losing ash
quickly,
quite so rapidly from the landscape?
Yes, and that's the problem. We're losing ash quicker than we can get resources together. Although Jennifer Cook is working very, very hard, and getting, I mean, Jennifer's incredible at what she's been able to do, but it's also an issue with butternut. Butternut's disappearing. I mean, it's mostly extirpated from the south and it's threatened in Canada. It's on their endangered species list. So timing is a problem with these novel pests. We got lucky with like elm. Dutch elm disease is terrible, but there's a lot of elm in the woods and it's coming, you know, it's kind of evolving resistance and we can find plus trees. And there's a tree improvement program trying to improve resistance, but time is often not on our side with these novel invasives.
Right. And so one of the things we talked about yesterday quite a bit was, you know, how slowing the spread of invasive species can buy time. And
yes.
Talked a lot about detection as part of the larger picture of slowing spread. And so it's good to sort of see this very vividly in the webinar series as we progress, because, you know, the reality of all the actions that we talked about yesterday in terms of slowing the spread, early detection, the ability to catch infestations early in case they will prove to be manageable or at least somewhat manageable,
right.
And plays into your you know, resources of whether or not there's enough time to capture enough resistant individuals to create resistant stock.
Right, and the resistance is a tool. You need slow the spread, you need biocontrols, you need resistance breeding, you need people scouring the landscape. It's all these pieces work together. They should not be competing. We need all of it to be successful. Excellent.
Yeah, and that really speaks to the need for the intensive amounts of partnerships that we all engage in. Awesome. Well, we have time for one more short question for Carrie, but please also remember at the end of our 3 lead presentations, we'll have extra Q&A time. Something speaks to you during the course of another presentation, you can always bring it up. So if anybody has one last quick thing, you can pop it into the chat, or like I said, Q&A is fine too. I'll read them out loud no matter where they show up. So I'm going to give just like a couple seconds for somebody to frantically type into the chat. We'll see. I don't get the little dots to see if somebody's typing, so I might just be using time. All right. Seeing none, we will refer any future questions addressed to Carrie to the end of the presentation. And instead, thank you very much, Carrie, for your presentation. And I am going to, we had a standing ovation from Sarah Fitzsimmons, the American Chestnut Foundation. She's coming to us from the most tree researcher lab background I've seen in days. So I'm really excited to see like a lab bench and some test tubes, maybe, I don't even know, but it's a pleasure to have you, Sarah. So please give a very brief introduction of yourself and then open up your slides when you're ready.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Fitzsimmons. I work with the American Chestnut Foundation, and I am at Penn State. I'm glad Carrie gave a tip of the hat to here at Penn State. We host the Schatz Center for Tree Molecular Genetics, and they've been working on a host of tree issues, and one of which is ash, and we've been working on chestnut here for a long, long time. So I'm going to cover some updates of where we're at with that program. What you see behind me is we are testing this year's, we did a lot of controlled pollinations. We did 1,000 bags worth of controlled pollinations this year for transgenic trees, and we're testing them to see which ones are transgenic and which ones are not. So Carrie, that was phenomenal. As someone who's been in tree breeding for 20 years and not as long as some people have, that was a really amazing, concise way of talking about resistance breeding. And in addition, back to that question of involving new technologies, I'm definitely going to talk about transgenics and genetic modification, but you can't do that stuff without all of those tools that Carrie mentioned. So you still have to find trees, you still have to do controlled pollinations, you still have to find a resistance screening method. So all of the groundwork that's being laid right now with those species doing those resistance, those traditional breeding programs are laying the groundwork not only for genomic sequencing and all of that kind of stuff, which is what's going to take to do transgenics or CRISPR or any sort of gene editing in the future. It's also laying the groundwork for all that hands-on applied stuff that you're going to have to do in order to get the material created and deployed in the landscape. American chestnuts. If you guys have not seen an American chestnut, this is kind of what it looks like. The tree on the right is a large American chestnut that used to be alive in Berlin, Vermont, but recently passed on because of the blight. It has a long beautiful leaf shape, canoe shaped, breaking ocean wave dentation, and creates these really amazing chestnuts, which are highly nutritious and delicious, and come 3 to a spiny burr. This is the great time to talk about chestnuts. I'm sure you all have heard Nat King Cole's Christmas song about chestnuts roasting on an open fire. I love this picture of a person standing at the base of an over 100-foot tall tree that was in Connecticut in the early 1900s, and just the timber quality of this tree is really spectacular. There was a fungal disease that was introduced in the late 1800s, the chestnut blight fungus, now called Cryphonectria parasitica, spread widely throughout the eastern US, which is the range of the American chestnut, and I heard the term functional extinction, and that's where we're at with the American chestnut. Trees still exist in the understory, but they don't serve their ecological purpose anymore because they keep getting hit by this blight fungus. So the goal of the work that I do with the Chestnut Foundation and our affiliated partners is to restore the tree to its grandeur. And we do that through a variety of methods. I love this, just repeating all the tools in the toolbox. It's so imperative in these huge, large scale, large temporal, big ecological problems. You have to use all the tools at your disposal. So the way that the Chestnut Foundation calls it is 3 burr. And I love this. There are 3 chestnuts in a burr. We've got 3 Bs that we throw at this problem. We've got breeding, biocontrol, biotechnology, united for restoration. And that's how we kind of concisely talk about what we do in terms of making a disease-resistant tree to get it back into the landscape. Traditional breeding has been going on since the early 1900s. Frank Meyer of Meyer Lemon fame was sent over to China to get Chinese chestnuts and bring it back into the US. He did that in 1914, 1915. And ever since then, people have been breeding chestnuts for disease resistance. This is the chestnut seed orchard at Penn State that I help oversee with my colleagues, Steve Hoy and Jean Najjar and others. And you can see the results of our screening. So we take the chestnut blight, we put it in the tree. Those that make it get selected and get bred to the next generation. Those that don't get marked with pink paint get cut down and get thrown onto the burn pile. And we do that over and over, many times over. But you can see we've got trees that are growing, that we've restored this American growth type. We've determined this both by measuring growth characteristics. We're also doing tons of genetic sequencing to look at how much American character and quality do we have in these trees. Is it 80%? Is it 75%? Is it 90%? What is it? We use that as part of our determination of selection. And then you can see this resistance here at the bottom. It's pretty good. It's not as high as had originally been hypothesized when this traditional breeding program started, but it's still pretty good. And kind of to Carrie's point of this iterative process of climbing this ladder, that's where we're at, where we have been with chestnuts since the early 1900s, and we keep improving it over time through traditional breeding. Biocontrol, there's not a whole lot that we can do with that just yet, but there is a phenomenon where the chestnut fungus gets infected by a virus. And so we're working with partners to try and improve that. There are bacteria, there are other fungi that are antagonistic to the chestnut blight fungus. And all of these are being investigated as ways to supplement traditional breeding and also the biotech work. So again, none of these are silver bullets. They all need one another in order to function and work in a large scale restoration program. So these are all just tools that we'll deploy together over time. Biotech is really where this is the buzzword. This is what people always say, why aren't you using CRISPR? Why don't you just CRISPR the genome? And there you have it. And I think it's really interesting, this thought that the biotech route is faster in some ways, and in many ways it's not. So the biotech program on American chestnut has been actively working since the mid 80s. And so while it has achieved higher resistance in a shorter amount of time, it still has taken about 40 years to get to the point where there's a tree that is deployable into the landscape. You have to find a gene that works. You have to find a way to get it into the genome of the species of interest. You have to figure out a way to get it propagated. Then you have to figure out a way to get it into the landscape. And then you have to figure out a way to get it diversified. And all of those steps take a lot of time and a lot of money. So it's definitely heavily resource intensive. Not that traditional breeding isn't, but traditional breeding typically can be done by virtually anyone. You don't need lab space generally, it can be effectively scaled up very quickly and easily. So they all take time, though. We're working with trees. So in terms of biotech, yes, CRISPR is being looked at. Yes, we're looking at genetic engineering. There's lots of other kinds of stuff that's out there. I'm going to talk most specifically about one clone that's been going through. This has been developed by our partners at SUNY ESF. They're in Syracuse. This is Bill Powell and his colleagues, Andy Newhouse, and many, many others who have been working on this program. This is taking a gene from wheat and putting it into American chestnut through a process called agrobacterium-mediated transformation. And everybody always picks on me because I just like to say agrobacterium-mediated transformation, but go home, look it up. It's great reading material. If you need to fall asleep tonight, check it out, Google it. But here's really the interesting part where, trying to figure out, okay, what gene do we use? How do we get it in there? What tissue do we use? It turns out chestnut embryos, you can use agrobacterium mediated transformation with chestnut embryos, throw it into tissue culture, get it out into the field. That process takes about 18 months from start to finish. So, and again, to what Carrie said, you've still got to figure out a resistance screening methodology. That's still ongoing. We're still trying to improve that and find a good method for screening for resistance. And you still got to do the pollinations, and you still got to find lingering American chestnuts to diversify what is a clone. So this clone is called Darling 58. And where we are right now is you can only plant Darling 58 under heavy permitting by USDA APHIS. And so there are, I'm hand waving a little bit, but there's maybe 20, 24 sites where this material has been planted. It's all under permit. If we want to do restoration with a transgenic American chestnut, we have to get it deregulated. There's no way that you can do forest restoration under USDA permitting guidelines. Number one, they don't let you let it flower and propagate. So that's the biggest downside in terms of a restoration program. So the idea is that you have to get, in order to get deregulation of a genetically modified organism, of a tree species, you have to seek regulatory approval by the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA. And that process was started. So our partners at SUNY ESF, they were the ones who submitted the dossier to the USDA in January of 2020. That dossier went out for public comment at the end of 2020. And this is really interesting. So I'm glad, Lee and Carrie, you guys brought up, what is the public perception of GMOs at this point? And what we found, we were able to download all the comments that came in from the public comment period about this dossier, about Darling 58. We found 63% of those who commented during that public comment period were in favor of deregulation of American chestnut. Less than, so 47% or so were negative, but a great majority of those were form letters. So most of them were written up by another organization, probably the Global Justice Ecology League. People signed it and copied and pasted, copy, paste, copy, paste. And so typically the USDA looks at those as single comments. If it's just a copy paste, they condense it down and that's a single comment. So what the USDA typically looks for is substantive comments, something that allows them to provide new and novel information that allows them to make a decision for or against. And what they're looking at is this organism going to become or present a plant pest risk? And so that's mainly what they're doing through this process of evaluating all of the information submitted by the applicants, evaluating all the information submitted through these public comment periods. So this was a really fascinating process for us, the Chestnut Foundation and ESF and others, to go through to see where does public comment currently stand on these GMOs. The USDA website is amazing. The federal registry, it's not just USDA, it's all of the different federal agencies. You can go to the federal registry and get gobs of information about rules that these different agencies have been making. And so you go to the APHIS part, and you look at how many organisms the USDA has evaluated for plant pest safety. And so you look at different commodities, obviously they're going to be the most. Corn, soybeans, cotton, that kind of stuff. There have been a few flower species submitted for consideration. And then trees, we've got 5 submitted for deregulation, 2 are pending, 2 have been withdrawn, 3 got approved. Apple is for it's a non-browning gene. Plum is for plum pox, and papaya is for ring spot virus. They all got deregulated. Eucalyptus was not deregulated, and they haven't formed a decision on it. It's still pending. And what's interesting is, again, Carrie mentioned this, that you have people who say if it's for forest health, they're generally for it. Even these commodities, apple, plum, papaya, you did see, I want to eat this apple. If you go through and you read the comments, I want to eat this apple. I need this. This is great. There were still 72,000 signatures against GMO apple. Eucalyptus was kind of through the roof in terms of the number of comments that said, you will ruin the environment. This is absolutely horrible and preposterous, although you find that comment in all of these types of deregulation petitions. But I've definitely seen support for transgenics increase over time. During the public comment process for Darling 58, we had official policy or organizational statements in support of deregulation from a lot of official federal and state forestry agencies. The Forest Service gave us a thumbs up. We had the state forestry agencies of these various states give the thumbs up. The Nature Conservancy, Society of American Foresters, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians all gave public comments in support of deregulation, and that's fantastic. The Sierra Club is another great example of someone who went vehement opposition to GMOs in 2000. They still have a specific statement against GMO technologies on their website. They had lukewarm non-opposition in 2020. They wrote an article on American chestnut. I highly recommend it, not only because I'm featured in it and my picture's in it and everything, but it's also a really wonderful overview about chestnut and the discussion about deployment of traditional breeding material and biotech. But they submitted a comment in support of this work. So you see this definite shift from very, very negative general public perception of GMOs now to a shift of approval, especially if it's used for forest health issues and for native species. People tend to approve that much more than those that are used for commercial applications, especially if it's going toward a native species and for sustainability of our native forests. So there's a lot of steps moving ahead, and I wish I could make this more colorful, but and easy to read. But the USDA petition was submitted in January of 2020. The first public comment period happened in August of 2020. The USDA submitted a notice of intent at the end of this year. In that notice of intent, they say they expect to develop their EIS, or environmental impact statement, in 2 years from the date of that NOI, from the notice of intent. So that would put us around August of 2023. They do have the capacity to extend that. It could be before, it could be after. So the USDA decision could be somewhere around the end of 2023, but we really don't know. There's no definitive timelines with that agency. The EPA petition was submitted in late summer of this year. And they have 18 months from the time of submission to make a decision, and the FDA usually follows suit. So we should see a decision from them by spring of 2023. And we're hopeful that the USDA will also make a decision within that same timeline. But again, kind of hedging our bets, maybe we won't see an official decision by all 3 agencies until the end of 2023. Hand waving. I can't say for sure on any of these. So don't quote me on any of this. Even when the agencies deregulate transgenic American chestnut, it's a clone. Darling 58 is a clone, and it needs to be deployed into a wide variety of backgrounds to get to a founding population or a effective population of 500, which is sort of the gold standard and the golden rule. We actually want to breed on a minimum of 500 wild type American chestnut trees. We have a higher goal of 1,000. backgrounds. And that's the work that we're doing right now. And what you see us working on here at our lab is to increase the diversity of material. We have germplasm conservation going on. Again, this is a great way, people going out and finding lingering trees, finding wild material, collecting seed, planting them, transplanting sprouts, grafting scion, which is very difficult. So if anyone, I definitely want to get in touch with these beach grafters if they can give us any tips on how to vegetatively propagate chestnut. That's a real big challenge for us. But these are all ways that we can conserve wild material, get it into ex situ collections, and then use that for diversification of disease-resistant material. Here's where we know about American chestnut. This is primarily from forest inventory data. There's still an estimated 425 million American trees out on the landscape. So even though they're functionally extinct and they're basically sprouts in the understory, there's still a ton of them. And we really want to focus on this area down here. If you guys can see my cursor, I'm focusing on the southwestern portion of the range, where based on a lot of genetic data and multiple replications of different types of studies, this is where all of our diversity is. Well, not all of it, but a huge amount of our diversity is down here in the Southern Appalachians. This is where we need to really focus our diversity. This is the diversity that's most at risk due to climate change. This is where we're going to lose, where we are losing, and where we are going to continue to lose material. And so this is where we want to focus our conservation efforts currently, and also in terms of deploying and diversifying disease-resistant material. Then you got to figure out how to get it out in the woods. So this is Blooming Grove Hunt Club. This is in Pike County, northeastern Pennsylvania. We've planted some 2,000 trees up on this location. There are an estimated 100 million acres of suitable habitat across the eastern US that can support American chestnut planting. There are some areas that's highly suitable, like these gorgeous rock piles of central Pennsylvania. It grows gorgeous American chestnuts, but I doubt we're going to be planting there. We're going to rely on planting in areas that are easily accessed, that are highly suitable, and then let things like the Allegheny wood rat or blue jays disperse them across the landscape. So that's another challenge that we're working on right now. We're setting an initial goal of 1% of that suitable landscape. So let's say we're going to actively work to plant 1 million acres of suitable habitat in the next 100 years. And that's still going to be a challenge. We've developed best management planting practices, guidelines, and monitoring for American chestnut. That's ongoing and is available to folks who are interested. Again, huge amount of agencies that we'll have to work with, lots of private landowners to cover 1 million acres. That is just a crazy amount of land. And to get the amount of seedling production to cover that land, I mean, we're talking tens of millions, hundreds of millions of seedlings that are going to be needed to plant that. And again, Carrie is talking about, a lot of our great nurseries in the States are closing just when we need them the most. So we've been working not only with the amazing state nurseries, they are really phenomenal resources. We've been working with some private nurseries, but this is going to be our biggest bottleneck. I don't think planting the trees is going to be the biggest bottleneck. I think this production is going to be the biggest bottleneck in getting chestnut and other threatened tree species back out on the landscape. Really rough timeline. Again, a lot of hand waving. Don't quote me on any of these numbers, just to kind of give you a sense of where we're at. We got Darling 58. Hopefully that gets deregulated. We've got good material coming out from traditional breeding programs. That's being deployed and will be deployed in the near future. But there's better stuff coming behind it. Again, Carrie mentioned you've got this iterative process, not only for traditional breeding, but for all technologies. Who knows what really phenomenal inventions are going to come out in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years that it's going to take to restore the species. We can deploy those methods on top of what goes out now. So Darling 58 is good. It's on a constitutive promoter. There are potential disadvantages to that. We don't know that there are, but that remains to be seen. We can't deploy landscape level tests to test that because it's regulated. So in the background, there's a wound inducible promoter for Darling 58 or for the oxalic oxidase gene. That paper was just published last week. So check that out. If you look up American chestnut wound inducible promoter, that's another really amazing innovation that's on that's on the doorsteps. We need to stack resistance. We've got not just chestnut blight, but we've got Phytophthora root rot to worry about. We've got traditional breeding dealing with that. We should be able to deploy that in the next 8 to 10 years. Gene editing, can we deploy CRISPR? We're working on it. We're looking for the areas of the genome that we can edit to deploy that. Maybe we can get that done in the next 10, 20 years. And then, like I said, who knows what really amazing scientific innovations are going to happen even in the next 30 years that we can deploy and improve populations that get deployed from there. I expect, based on current production and based on what we can start planting now, we're probably going to get to about 2 million seedlings per year production by 2060. Maybe we'll hit it sooner than that. If we've got a 1 million acre goal for planting, we should have planted that 5% of that by 2060. We still have a long way to go, and that's 40 years from now. So how do we get resistance is step one. Then you got this whole other slew of logistical issues when you're looking to restore a species, and it's really going to be an all hands on deck kind of a problem. I love this picture. This is really what we're shooting for. Ben Jarrett took this. I really love it. It's an American chestnut overlooking the mountains of Asheville, North Carolina. And I hope I still have time for questions. I'm happy to answer them. And feel free, here's my email address and office number since I'm back in the office a lot these days.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah. And yes, we can take questions until 20 after the hour. So you got 12 minutes. What I will start off by doing is reading you out a couple of questions that came in via chat, and then we'll kind of see where that takes us. One moment. Okay, Gary Fish from Maine asks, when you were talking about the levels of, well, okay, let me explain. So to remind everybody, so we were talking about how there's 3 federal agencies in the United States that need to pass through a regulatory process. So Gary Fish asks, do you think all this regulation is necessary? And is this type of breeding significantly different? That strikes me as 2 totally different questions. But can you offer your thoughts on that, Sarah?
I think the regulatory oversight is necessary. I think the way that it's implemented on forest trees is not necessarily appropriate. What's happening is you've got commercial ag rules being applied to trees. And I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't envy these guys and how they're doing what they can, but it's really difficult to, even though trees are plants, I get it, but you've got such huge generation times. You've got they grow different. We're not planting at tens of thousands of trees per acre. We're planting at like 100 trees per acre, 500 trees per acre, maybe, you know, so some of these rules that are more applicable to crops and annuals or perennials it's not a one-to-one to trees. So do I think regulation is necessary? Yes. I want, especially in an example like cold tolerant eucalyptus, I think that's the perfect example of an organism that needs really close inspection. That really could become a plant pest risk. I'm not saying that particular one is, but that's an example where you really need that regulatory oversight to help really review things like that.
Right, so it sounds like you think that regulatory oversight is necessary and important, but perhaps in this case, it's not exactly aligned with the biology of tree breeding programs.
Yeah, and especially for native trees and for forest health, I think and again, I'm not in a governmental agency, so I can't speak to the challenges that would be associated with overhauling regulations. But that's what I would like to see. I would like to see there being different categories for trees specifically, but also forest health and sustainability versus commercial ag and commercial forestry applications.
Okay. And then the follow-up question to that, which like I said, is actually kind of a different question. Is this type of breeding, so genetic technology-based breeding, significantly different? And that's a kind of a philosophical question.
I guess so. I mean, there are people who just have a knee-jerk reaction against genetic modification, but even the breeding, we've got people who are adamantly against breeding with Chinese chestnut, and any amount of Chinese chestnut is too much. So 6 in one, half a dozen in the other, and it really is a philosophical something that you have to ask internally. And for the Chestnut Foundation, if it restores the ecological services of the American chestnut, and that's what we're interested in.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's go with the next question. Karen Lombard with the Nature Conservancy asks, are we likely to lose sprouts, the viability of the existing incredible amount of sprouts still in the landscape, right? Are they starting to disappear, presumably from old age, root rot, etc.? So that kind of gets back to our timeline question that Carrie brought up, that where ash is on a pretty tight timeline because it's disappearing so fast. Where are we with that for chestnut?
Yes, you see the Little made the native range of American chestnut in 1977. That's this line around here, and you can see it's kind of shifted where we see populations currently. Where we've definitely lost trees is in the southwestern and far western component. I know I talk with volunteers all the time who found trees in the 80s, in the 1980s, and the 1990s in southern Indiana, in northern Alabama, and northern Mississippi. They are gone. And we still have a plethora of trees in the heart, what I call the heart of the range. And I think we're going to find that for other species. In the real core heart of the range, we will retain trees, but that's not where the heart of diversity is. And so that's great. We have got 400 million trees to work with, but do they contain as much diversity as we need to work with? There is a race against the clock to collect the trees and have the most resistance. And I think a lot of programs that work on this, and I would implore any program that's starting out, step number one, determine the amount of diversity and where it is, and really focus collection and conservation in areas that have the greatest amount of diversity.
I have a related question. That's a pretty stark southern pattern. Is climate change, habitat alteration? Do you know what's driving that very, fairly obvious southern pattern?
I think we lost a lot of the southeastern component of American chestnut to Phytophthora root rot. So that's sort of an unrelated pathogen. And I think that's continuing throughout, but definitely climate change and definitely land use. That land use and is really what affected it in Ohio, from what I can tell. If anything was farmed, if anything, obviously you're going to remove the sprouts. So disturbance is definitely a factor. But climate change is going to remove what remnants, what few remnants we have left of this species.
Right, and then on sort of the counterpoint is that the definitions by the native range of Little map don't align with the current arc of yellow areas. Is that new range, or is that limitations on the original native range mapping?
I expect that was limitations on the original, because so Little would have done his work post Phytophthora. That would have been 1977. Phytophthora was in the late mid 1800s, and he worked his methodology, and he mentions this in his prologue. He says, my methodology ain't that great. I'd like to do some other stuff, but I don't have time because I'm doing all the species. So yeah, I'd say there are definite limitations, but it's what we got. But it could definitely be improved. And there are other types of maps that you can go with, but Little's is still sort of the gold standard.
Okay, great. Well, that clarifies it a lot. So it was probably just that that particular range was not mapped with great scientific accuracy necessarily. Okay. All right, moving on to the next question. And just a reminder to all, we're hoping to start our next presentation at 20 after. So is that right? Yes, at 20 after, sorry. So we have 4 minutes. We're keeping right on schedule. I'm pretty excited. Gary Fish wanted to return to sort of the question of what and why is regulated. So he asks, what if a cold tolerant eucalyptus was developed through traditional breeding, and would that be regulated?
You're right. No, it would not be. And so, and that's often a question about the regulatory process, period, is you could make anything. And a lot of these invasive pests, they're kind of regulated, but they can come over whenever they want. That's why we have this problem in the first place. So yeah, if you develop anything by traditional breeding, there's no stop to it. And yeah, but then again, do you have a lot more leverage to be able to create unique things, unique plant materials through these novel technologies? I'd say that might be the difference, is that you can create something that's wholly different and not possible through traditional techniques. And I think that's the argument for regulating it.
Yeah, that's good to keep in mind. Well, I have a question. If you can hop forward to your grand scheme timeline. That one. Excellent. I want to just say I was really surprised by how many seedlings we're looking at here. And I'm wondering, what sorts of huge jumps in conceptualizing this problem do we need to make to not be looking at, 2 million seedlings in, what the heck would that be, 39 years, but 2 million seedlings a lot sooner. How can we deploy this at, exponentially faster? Because that's what it's going to actually take to create ecosystem level change. So how do we look at this and say, this isn't how I want it to play out. I want it to play out at scale faster. And I'm curious what your thoughts are before we get started on the climate change talk, which is going to talk about a new perspective.
Yeah, so one of our biggest roadblocks right now is obviously the regulatory oversight. We need to get deregulation. So, where does that timeline start is kind of when it gets deregulated, because we can't plant seed orchards en masse until that happens. Once that happens, then we can plant seed orchards, but all of our materials is in a hemizygous state. So any nuts that we get from those trees, or only half of them are going to have the gene. So that's another roadblock. So now we got to create homozygosity for this gene and deploy those seed orchards, and that'll take time. And then you talk about the stacked seed, the stacked resistance of these better materials, and then you've got to deploy homozygosity for the oxogene with Phytophthora mixed in there, and then you got to deploy seed orchards of that material. And so there are a lot of logistical issues on the back end. It's not just planting a bunch of seed orchards, it's logistics that we have on our back end. And I will say, a lot of the nursery partners that we've worked with, we give them 100 seeds and we're getting 20 seedlings back. So I know we can do better, but we've got some real strict bottlenecks in terms of just improving the cultural work of bare root production. I know containerized could probably do better, but now you're talking $5 a seedling, which I don't know if that's gonna fly for restoration. So yeah, there's a lot of logistical considerations, and I'd say, there's a lot of room for exploration and improvement of nursery practices for chestnut specifically, and for what we're doing. We would love to have more folks working on alleviating the challenges and bottlenecks that we have in production.
Excellent. All right. We will address all other comments and questions for Sarah's presentation after Katie's presentation has concluded, because that's going to be our open discussion time. So Sarah, if you can please unshare your window. Thank you. And I am going to invite our next speaker, Katie Barlow with the Nature Conservancy, to please hit share on her presentation, and I will stay here and just make sure your audio works, so forth. Getting the slideshow cleaned up. That looks great. And Katie, we can't hear you yet, so let's get you.
Help to come off mute.
Perfect. All right, you're ready to go.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Barlow. I work for the Nature Conservancy's Central Appalachians program. I'm based in West Virginia, but I get to work with my colleagues from Pennsylvania all the way down to Eastern Tennessee. So today I'll be sharing with you our TNC's effort over the last several years to create guidance internally for how we manage for climate resilience. So just to start off, the topic of managing for climate resilience is a concept that pulls together much of the familiar content of using science and implementing planning through the lens of maintaining or enhancing the ability of a landscape to continue to provide ecosystem functions and services despite the changes in climate that are happening now and will continue to be exacerbating the functionality and services of our ecosystems. So I'll be sharing the Nature Conservancy's journey over the last few years in defining and testing what it means to manage for resilience. Having some advancing slide issues.
Sometimes if you just kind of click on it twice with an arrow, it'll work. Like,
there we go.
There.
All right, so my objectives for this presentation are to share the Nature Conservancy's science and conceptual frameworks that are integral to this guidance that we have just released, and also how to use this guidance. So these objectives are interwoven throughout this presentation. So why would we spend the time to create guidance on how to manage for resilience? Well, the Nature Conservancy is the owner and manager of some of the largest network of private conservation lands in the United States. So it's our opportunity to leverage the lands that we manage. TNC's US land-based assets include 2.5 plus million acres for preserves, and for conservation easements over 3.2 million acres. So this is an invaluable portfolio of conservation lands that directly advances our mission. And we have the opportunity to protect biodiversity and demonstrate best management practices and think through how we do that from the lens of future climate changes. So this is our next step from prioritizing resilient lands to managing resilient systems. And I'll get into more of our resilient land science in a minute here. So here's the front page of our document, our guidance document for managing for climate resilience on the Nature Conservancy preserves and managed lands in the Eastern United States. A guidance for land managers at the Nature Conservancy. And you can find it on our website for the Center for Resilient Conservation Science. It's one of our external TNC web pages. If you go to this link and scroll down, you'll see a link for this guidance document. So what does this document cover? It covers guidance for the Eastern United States, as it says in the title. It covers core principles for managing for resilience, how to set the important groundwork, including socio-ecological considerations, prioritization, how to use an adaptive management cycle with a climate resilience lens, and designing management for a particular site. So we start with the stage, for example, the soils, the fresh water, the stage, what TNC calls the stage. And then we move on to how to manage the systems on the environmental site, or the stage, the composition and structure, and as this group would be interested in, addressing harmful species such as invasives. So this guidance document is not meant to be a step-by-step guide, because managers, you already know how to do this. It's meant to help you take a new approach with a climate resilience framework. This is also not a static document. It's an initial compilation and synthesis of actionable research. And we are very interested in your feedback. So please go to this website, download the document, particularly if you are a manager. We're interested to see how you step through the information in this document and give us feedback on what's helpful, what's not, and how we can improve together. So managing for resilience takes a lot of familiar components of what you're probably all used to as managers and strategy leads. It takes an understanding of foundational science on climate resilience. It takes ecological strategies to manage for resilient systems. And it takes using the science and strategies to develop planning and then implementing and learning. So I'm going to talk through these 4 concepts, or these 4 components of managing for resilience, and how we implement this through the document. So the foundational science, we'll start off with science here. This is a map of the Nature Conservancy's Resilient Connected Lands Network. It's our foundational science for planning for climate resilience to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem function. And we started off on this journey as TNC is, our mission is to help protect 30% of the Earth's lands and waters by 2030, joining many other global and national and local governments and nonprofits. And to accomplish this, we needed to work collaboratively and strategically. And in order to work collaboratively across a large landscape, we need to know what places to prioritize. And so our Center for Resilient Conservation Science, the Nature Conservancy, has spent the last 10 years working on a resilient and connected lands analysis for the United States to map the places that are most resilient to climate change. So this is our blueprint for the Nature Conservancy's Protect Lands and Waters strategy, and it guides many of our internal priorities and is growing amongst our partners as a guide for land protection and management. So this was a large, just to demonstrate that this was a large group effort and was tailored to each specific ecoregion across the United States, with the input of experts from each region to serve as advisors. And it has 3 components, 3 ingredients, you could say, including resilient lands, permeable landscapes, so where the landscape is connected to allow movement and species range shifts, and resilient systems. So all of these 3 components include, if you were to map these, the site resilience is the geophysical layers of that provide for biodiversity long-term, climate flow being the permeability of the landscape, how connected is the landscape, and then matched with confirmed biodiversity. And putting those 3 ingredients together where they overlap, we have the Resilient and Connected Lands Network. So it's a very detailed methodology to create this map, and it's all out there for you all to peruse and use, as I will share in a minute here. But this is one way to visualize. This is different data, a different data set, but it's one way to visualize the need for this kind of foundational science, because we know that there will be gradual movement of populations in response to climate change. And so we need to understand, where we need to protect lands that will be most resilient to climate change. And to start with, TNC has worked towards this big goal of creating this resilient and connected lands network. But when this was released, I think a lot of us were asking, well, what do we do next? How do we use this science? And this is our opportunity to ask the questions of, if these are the places that we're going to manage, how do we manage for resilient systems? How do we manage for climate resilience on these resilient sites? And you could define, your ecological goals in many different ways. Maybe it's connectivity and biodiversity, ecosystem functions, or maybe it's a suite of other ecological goals that you have. So there are several places where you can access this data. The easiest being our resilient lands mapping tool. But you can also download the data and use it on your own platforms. And there are many places to learn more, many reports and examples of using this science in preserve and lands management. So we've just talked through the foundational science that guides the planning of where we work and sets the foundation for this guidance document that we've worked together on. And now we'll talk a little bit more about, how we work on those places. We need strategies, planning, and to learn. So some of the management approaches that we talk about in our guidance document, you could consider when you're looking at a large landscape and considering sites to manage for, where we just need to monitor for unacceptable change. Then you might consider places where we need to resist that change. And then there are other places where we need to manage for resilience. And in this case, meaning, where do we help enhance the system to maintain its ecosystem functions and services through a transition into the next phase. And you may see this in other framework names, such as the resist, resilience, and transition framework, or RAD, resist, adapt, and demonstrate. So some of the principles that we go through to help you come from a new strategic approach. We want to think about how we manage stage, and stage is, again, what TNC uses to refer to the geophysical stage place of the ecosystem. So the components of the soils and water and fires or disturbance regimes that make up the dynamics of a system, and managing for those components. You may want to think about how to expect and manage for transition. We know that things are already changing. Sometimes it can be difficult to let go of some of those components of an ecosystem that we love, or we can't imagine not having within the system to be able to provide the services that we need, but we need to start thinking about how we manage that transition. I want to think about in anticipating the new impacts, but we also need to attend to the existing stressors. And I think that's something that this group is probably thinking a lot about, the existing stressors of invasive pests and pathogens. We need to work with natural processes. So not working against natural processes, but trying to work with them to manage for our ecological goals. We can adopt multiple strategies, whatever options there are in the ecosystem to address our goals, work with natural processes and the sources. We need to adapt to our new goals and take the plunge. So those are some of the strategies. And next we'll cover some of the planning components that we talk about and work through in our managing for climate resilience guidance. We share an adapted framework for adaptive management. So you might want to start with assessing climate impacts to resilience. And then once you understand the impacts of climate to the system, that will help inform how you select a management strategy. So, do you need to resist? Do you need to start transitioning? How is that going to help you reach your goals? And then work towards designing management for that site. And then, of course, implementing, learning, and sharing. So for that first component of a adaptive management framework, assessing climate impacts to resilience, we talk through some of the things you might want to consider for climate exposure and vulnerability, geophysical setting, and in your case, for the folks that are in this audience thinking about managing invasive pests and pathogens at a continental scale, you might want to think about within systems level, how will climate exacerbate the existing stressors that are on a system? And many of you are thinking about some vulnerable keystone species that might have an outsized impact on the landscape at scale. And then for the landscape context, you might want to think about is there a range-wide risk, or is the risk localized? And that will help you make some decisions as you move towards a prioritization. And when you're thinking about the impacts, climate impacts to resilience. And this can be a part of a typical prioritization, a spatial prioritization scheme where you're considering the natural assets, the human assets, the risks to those assets, and the benefits that you would get from particular actions, the feasibility and the return on investment of particular actions. So this can all, again, fit within very familiar ways of thinking through conservation planning. So really important point of getting beyond the analysis or paralysis by analysis is, or maybe for us, paralysis from too much planning, is to just get out there and do and learn, which is something that the Nature Conservancy, we really love to do with our partners on the ground and continue to learn together. And for this group, we do have a section on invasive pests and pathogens. As you all know, the invasive impact is often because of the levels of the impact. It's generally negative to ecosystem health, to function, to productivity, to diversity. And we're seeing that climate change is expanding the range of many of these species northwards and to higher altitudes. We were just speaking about that in this last talk. And that we're often seeing places where invasive pests and pathogens are favored by drought and warmer winters. So there's all these ways that these threats to ecosystems are being exacerbated by climate change. And so there's some big ways that we can help manage for resilience, really thorough monitoring programs that we track over time. We can work towards, at scale, facilitating the recruitment of native trees that have more resilience. We can work on recovery programs, such as some of the you've heard today, and of course, working towards policy measures that will help protect our ecosystems. And so with that, I will happy to take any questions. Love to hear your comments if you've been working on any programs within your organization to start managing for climate resilience. And again, we're really interested in your feedback on this guidance document. So please share your thoughts with us on this guidance.
Well, thanks, Katie. We can leave this screen up for a minute so that during the question and answer session, you can toggle through different slides if that's important. I see that Karen Lombard has a question that actually, it's funny because it carried over from Sarah's presentation, but it is remarkably applicable to your presentation as well. So Katie, do you actually just want to mention very briefly the section on overbrowse? Because it applies both ways.
What was the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. You may not be able to see it. So Karen Lombard asked in regards to chestnut seedling survival, that seedling survival is going to be a challenge during outplanting and so forth as well, because you often lose seedlings to deer without expensive protection measures. And we see that in the Managing for Climate Resilience document. So if you could just chat about that section, that might be really helpful for the bigger picture.
Yeah, and Karen, feel free to chime in here. Karen, I don't, is Karen, our audience members able to speak?
They can just request to be taken off of mute and then they can speak.
Okay, so Karen Lombard was the lead of this effort. So, so
no pressure, Katie.
Karen, maybe you want to say, maybe you'd like to share your thoughts as well. But yeah, we do have a section on overbrowse, which you could toggle to in the document. But yeah, that's a significant concern, for myself, as we plant in the partnership that I'm involved in, the Red Spruce Restoration Partnership in the Central Appalachians, you know, we can, that's one of our biggest considerations with the numbers of seedlings that we plant, you know, managing for overbrowse. And there's, you know, I think there's some policy that we should be working on. But, you know, that's a significant challenge.
Okay, great. So Katie, first question in the chat, Gary Fish from Maine inquires, have you worked with the Northeastern Risk RISCC management group at the University of Massachusetts in Cornell regarding invasive plants as well?
I actually, if Karen Lombard would love to come off of mute, I'm pretty sure that she has. So I work in the Central Appalachians, and I personally have not, but I think that that the Nature Conservancy has in that part of the U.S.
It is also possible that Karen may have stepped out.
No, I'm
Okay.
here. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, thank you for joining us. Sorry.
My husband had called me right before you started talking, so I was like, I heard my name, and I'm like, okay, I gotta go. So if you can just repeat the question.
Well, we had two that I think apply to you, so I'll start from the beginning and give you both.
Well,
Okay.
I know I remember the question about the deer.
Okay.
Yes, that I submitted, but the right before, in terms of the invasive section. And I do want to say that I kind of drove the process and was the editor. So like my knowledge of specific sections could be, you know, it's a long document. So just put a little caveat.
Okay, that's good. So Karen, so the question that Gary Fish from the state of Maine had is, have you all, as a group working on this document, worked with Eastern Risk, which is RISCC management group at University of Massachusetts in Cornell regarding invasive plants?
Yes, and Gary, I think your name is familiar. You were on the recent meeting that we had. I'm involved in the risk group like you are, and so I had tried to incorporate some of the information that we've gotten for that great group, which is thinking a lot about invasive species and climate change, into the document.
Great. Karen, do you have anything else you want to add now that we've got you off mute?
Other than it's just sometimes it's, you know, we've got the climate change challenges, but we've got also so many existing challenges, you know, when you think about the invasives as they already are without climate change and the deer pressures. And so I think sometimes it's really hard to add in that climate change lens on top of it when you've already got just so much to do with existing threats. So I don't know that and you know, for the risk group is bringing us so many more species to even be concerned about. The Northeast is supposed to be a hotspot for invasive species with climate change. And then our herbicides may not work as well. So it's just, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but what I like about the document is it provides kind of a structured way to sort of think through it all. You might not change exactly what you're doing, but you might look out for some of these.
I'm glad we finally had somebody have a dog bark in the middle of the presentation. It's always a highlight for me. Karen, you can keep going if you have a moment.
No, I'm fine.
Well, so that's great. And actually we have just a comment from Tom Macy, who is Tom, I can't quite recall you. I know you're a forester in Ohio, but your position I can't remember off the top of my head. So Ohio's Forest Action Plan used the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Landscapes as a resource to identify their priority forest landscapes. And that's awesome to be reminded that the Resilient and Connected Landscape body of work is already informing forest planning. And so to have the Managing for Climate Resilience document as well to complement that moving forward is just going to be such a big asset to thinking about, you know, all the dimensions we put into that document as well. So thank you. One question, let's see, I had a question I wrote down, which was, you know, Katie, when we look at this, this document right now, it's oriented for the Nature Conservancy's internal use, even though it is a shared document with lots of different parties. Is there a plan that you know of moving forward to produce a version or iteration that's oriented for public use in northeastern forests, you know, more for the broader constituency of forest managers?
Yeah, I mean, the document as is written, even though in the title it says, you know, for the Nature Conservancy managers, you could consider yourself any lands that you're managing. This, I think this is appropriate. You know, if it's public lands, there may be other regulatory needs that you need to address, but you know, I think this framework is applicable to any lands management. And you know, we've gone through an extensive internal review process and wanted to, you know, at this point, just to get it out there, to get feedback. And you know, we'll be in discussion soon about, you know, next steps and further iterations and versions of this document. So I think to answer your question, stay tuned, and we may have different versions depending on the feedback that we get in the future.
Okay, great. And can you back up your slides a few to the site that had the various different URLs in case anybody needs to take one down?
Yeah, let me see if I can.
Usually you just click, yeah, there you go, you got it. I remember it was a couple, yeah. I'm asking for too much, Katie, sorry. It was in there, there you go, that's the one. So yeah, I was thinking, if folks want to look these up, that crcs.tnc.org has this document pretty prominently listed on it. If anybody has trouble accessing any of the documents that we mention on this webinar or others, you can always reach out either to the speakers or to myself, and we can get them to you. It's no problem. Well, at this point, Katie, do you have anything else, or does anybody else want to add something in the chat, or should we open up for discussion to the group? And Karen is calling out that I participated in document review. I did. I helped write the invasive species section, and I proofread some other sections. It was a huge team effort. And I should have probably mentioned that as like a conflict of interest. I helped write part of that. So does anybody else have a comment or question for Katie's presentation in specific before we open up to broader questions? I'm just going to kind of sit here awkwardly for a minute in case somebody's typing to see if anything shows up in the chat or the Q&A section. Hopefully, or remember, if you would like to request to give a question verbally, you can just ask Laurel to take you off of mute. It's pretty quick, and then you can be like Karen and talk to everybody. Okay, not seeing any questions additionally. Katie, thank you so much for your presentation and showing everybody this really cool resource. And at this point, we are open to any type of question about either Katie's presentation or Carrie's or Sarah's, or you can ask Erin about the Grand Challenges program as well. So just open discussion for anybody who's got a question. And I have a question for Sarah, but I was going to let the audience bring questions first. I don't see anyone's typing. So Sarah, I have a question. Actually, this applies to both Sarah and Carrie. You know, the question of the deer comes up, and it's such a sort of like nitty-gritty question, but how impactful are the threats on the ground of just sort of day-to-day ops in terms of like voles in the winter and deer in terms of putting out the volume of tree saplings that you really need to start for these programs? I mean, your loss rates in some areas must be really heartbreaking. So I just was wondering, like, you know, to get to 1 million seedlings, do we have to do 2 million seedlings and then give 1 million to the voles?
So part of that 1 million and 2 million number is counting on what I've seen is 50% survival.
Okay.
And then even a barrier. So I do not expect what we plant out. I don't expect more than 30% of what we plant to actually survive to sexual maturity for various reasons. And so based on the data that we have from the limited number of naturally regenerating populations of American chestnut that are still out there, which are few and far between, and we're losing them too, in order to get the greatest amount of allelic diversity of reproducing individuals, which is 169 per acre, you need to plant 300. So that's about 50% survival. That's at a really phenomenal location. That's at West Salem, Wisconsin, where the soil was phenomenal. They didn't have threats like lots of squirrels and lots of deer and lots of invasive species and stuff. So in an ideal location, you're going to get maybe 60% survival long-term. We're not going to see that here in PA or New York or New Jersey, where I work most actively. So, I mean, when I present those numbers, I'm working from about 30% survival, and even then, I might be a little bit too optimistic. But and not to take any thunder away from Carrie, but voles, Lord hoy, what else do we deal with on a daily basis? I mean, ambrosia beetle. I mean, all these other pests and diseases, bittersweet, mile a minute, all this stuff. When I try to put out a planting, and you have these things strangling my poor trees, like so whenever we go into a planting, so part of that habitat suitability, it isn't just if I plant it there, is the soil good or is the climate right? It's what are these other, like, if there are invasive species. I have this planting in a place called Trexler, and in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, and the thing is just covered in autumn olive and bittersweet and all this kind of stuff. And and I've got a planting in Pittsburgh, same thing. If you stop maintaining it, the invasive species is completely, I mean, even 20 years later, the invasive species just completely take over. So when I talk about, like, when I make a recommendation about chestnut and planting and restoration, I'm going to say get as far away from those places where you have lots of invasive species, because I don't see how you're going to be successful with the tools that we currently have.
Yeah, the invasive plants, the #1 forest health problem, if you ask the state forester of Indiana, is invasive plants. It's awful. It is a huge problem. It's not just unique to chestnut. It's any regeneration, especially in these hardwood belts. You know, when you get into conifer country, whether you're going north to conifer country or south to conifer country, they have different issues. So we've all got different challenges. And so some areas like Indiana, you get the deer and the invasive plants, and it's just, yeah, it's devastating. And the forester, it's really hard to do forestry. It's one of the reasons they don't do clear cut forestry in Indiana. You can't. You cut a clear cut and you're gonna battle the weeds for 20 years. So it is a huge thing. It's not, you know, every region's got issues. It is an enormous barrier. But this is why, and what I've also noticed with the deer is, like, boy, they love that nursery stock. They love those vertigated trees. So if you can think of this, at least for some systems, getting material out there, not so much on a scale issue like with chestnut, but getting material out there that will be the seed trees for the future. You know, with that kind of a thinking thought process, we can make some headway, but indeed, the problems that foresters face with getting seedlings in the ground and getting them to survive is a universal problem. It's a universal headache. But everybody's just got different issues and different insects and different plants and different deer that eat different things. The deer don't eat white pine in New England, but boy, they'll eat them in the lake states. It's like the same species of deer behaving differently.
The city I live in, the north end of the city has one species of deer, and the south end of the city has a different species of deer. So it can be highly site specific, and that's a very funny quirk of Missoula, Montana. But Carrie, on that note, Elizabeth Barnes asked a question: is that seedling loss typical, or is an issue particular to chestnut? And I think, considering you have the perspective of multiple nurseries, do you see very high seedling losses just in general with tree seedlings, or is chestnut really like the standout as being difficult to cultivate?
It varies. So like northern red oak is a big favorite of our deer in Indiana, which is why there isn't much of a northern red oak program, although it's the most highly planted hardwood, at least in this part of the country. So it's not unique to chestnut. but some places you can have better luck, but there's something about like nursery grown seedlings that the deer especially really, really like. But that's why in some places, if it's just natural regeneration is your best bet, promote it when you can. But like in the case of chestnut and ash, I mean, you're sometimes got to battle the natural regeneration. You get stump sprouts. I just learned about stump sprouting in beech forests, where it's like the susceptible beech keep coming back and making these thickets, and so the resistant stuff can't get a hold because of the stump sprouting. So it's a big problem, worse in some areas than in others.
Okay. Sarah, do you have anything to add to the seedling survivorship discussion, or have we kind of covered it?
This is I mean, the oak folks, right, have worked on this problem for decades, and I think chestnut's going to face a lot of the same issues that oak does. But what I find really interesting is when I've recently talked to service foresters and district foresters in Pennsylvania in particular, but beyond, and I say, what are you guys doing with artificial regeneration? You know, just in general, what is your strategy for artificial regeneration of hardwoods? You know, and their solution, their current strategy is to plant pine and then let the hardwoods come in underneath. Well, yeah, sure, but how are we going to get these species that need restored back in the landscape? We can't, you know. So I think it speaks to the difficulty of artificial regeneration of hardwoods in particular. When all these trillion tree planting projects, what are they planting? They're planting pine and poplar because they're super easy to regenerate and they grow super fast. So any of these programs, it's not specific to chestnut, it's going to be any of these restoration programs. We've got to find a way for these things we've got to find better nursery stock. We've got to find ways to outcompete the deer. We've got to find ways to battle these invasive species, or just find sites where, to Carrie's point, there are locations where those are not issues. Like Blooming Grove Hunt Club, I showed that picture. That's a beautiful location because there aren't that many invasive species, and the deer are taken care of because you're on hunt club property. So if you can find places like that, it's going to be easier. I'm not going to say it's easy, but there are going to be instances where it's going to be easier. But there's so many logistical nightmares out there that we've got to figure out if we're going to succeed in the plethora of forest sustainability issues that we're up against.
Yeah, and if you think of it as far as like the commercial pines and spruces, they've got industry, they've got people like who are going to plant those and take care of them. It's these restoration species. One, we don't have all the chemicals necessarily. We haven't made the investments in the regeneration, and it's mostly hardwoods. But these non-commercial trees are the ones that are really struggling, and they tend to be our hardwoods. The conifers, I mean, if there was a, loblolly pine, they got that system worked out. They're working on longleaf and shortleaf. They don't have this. It's a hardwood problem. It's a non-commercial species problem.
Right. Well, so I saw in the Q&A box, Faith Campbell says, breeding and restoration, there's a bit of a typo. She says some think will never work, but I think she means some things will never work. And this really gets to the heart of it. This is an incredible set of hurdles and pipelines, and some replanting will perhaps not work on landscape continental ecological restoration scale. And when we look at the course of the discussion that Erin and I have been sort of trying to bring forward with this whole webinar series of like, this is a continuum, and you start overseas and you try to prevent these things from arriving. Ultimately, it would be ideal if trees didn't reach the point where Carrie and Sarah had to figure out how to make the seedlings survive despite vole attack. It would be better if we never got there in the first place. It would be better if we prevented the introduction of additional tree killing forest insects and diseases before we got to the restoration step. But what's done is done. We can't undo chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, beech bark, whatever beech bark is, disease, all of those things, they're here. So, it kind of almost brings us back to the beginning. It would be much better if we didn't have these threats in North America, but we do. And so now we have to figure out how to try to get the trees back up.
Right, and we need more investment in the science behind restoration. Again, that we put our investment in the commercial species, but we have to invest in these native species and these non-commercial species, figure out the chemicals, figure out the cocktails, figure out all of this that we've worked out for the commercial species. And that's the investment piece that's a harder sell because you don't have all the commercial industries with the deeper pockets who are able to just say, oh, you can't let loblolly pine disappear. Of course not. So we need, yeah, it's investment, and in general, R&D is, I don't know if I can say this. Well, it doesn't get the funding that it needs. It doesn't, there aren't as many people willing to go to DC and lobby for R&D. And I say that, and I probably could get in trouble for saying it, but it's true. R&D is a lot harder. State and private, you know, we have states that can do that, states will lobby for state and private national forests. They have their groups, but we need people to want to support the kind of work that will help us overcome these problems.
Okay. Yeah. And actually Faith just piped in that I had actually mistaken her actual word for a typo. My apologies, Faith. So she was saying, you know, there's some people who think this simply won't ever work, which is it's got to, you know, without sufficient funding and without the public support as well as the policy support, some people just think it won't ever work out.
I like to think Faith, because I know Faith's, I know a lot of Faith has been in the weeds in this for her career. And I like to think that wheel is starting to turn the right way. I really hope it is. And we're trying hard. Talks like this, presentations like this. Look, we can do this. These are the steps. It's not rocket science. We can make gains with this and show a product and show some promise in a few years. And so Faith has been in the weeds and she has seen this probably more than anybody else, but I hope, Faith, that is changing. And Jennifer Cook has worked hard. Congress is starting to recognize this is a thing. And I hope I hope things start to look up, but it's these conversations that we have that can help move the dial on this.
Excellent. That's a very hopeful note. So I really appreciate it, Carrie. And I think you're right too, you know, with a lot of the incoming funding with some of the new government programs that are being approved, you know, we're looking at planting a lot of trees and we can't just plant commercial species like you were saying. We have to plant some, we really ought to plant some of these important, tricky, expensive hardwoods amongst with the cheaper, easier trees in order to create the biodiversity that we need across the continent. So that's a difficult measure, as you know, or a difficult message. We need expensive trees along with cheap trees, but it's real, you know. So, and you guys are producing very important, expensive trees. So Karen Lombard asks on the note of research, can mycorrhizal research help, also known as mother tree research?
Yeah, that mycorrhizal associations may be really important and really helpful. And there has been some really cool work. I want to say it was somebody in Canada who was looking at how a mother tree sends hormones out and communicates with her seedlings nearby and can help save them. And I was blown away by that. I think it's a TED Talk. So yes, and there is not enough work being done on the underground dynamics. And that is an area of research that might help. In addition to another tool, was it Suzanne? Okay, another tool that we need to consider. And that's where thinking, you know, if maybe instead of, you know, like putting a zillion trees in an area, we put a couple and we focus our attention on those and get those above the deer and get them healthy and established. And then those become the seed trees for the future might be a way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, so Gary Fish brings up, at least for now, linking as many of these issues to climate resilience is really important. I think we all say yes. That situation might not last, but it seems that money is flowing to climate issues. I think that's, you know, reading the tea leaves accurately. And then also the issues of tree equity. Now, we didn't touch on the tree equity conversation today, but we actually did cover some of that conversation yesterday in terms of, you know, putting trees where trees are needed in historically under-resourced urban and outside of urban environments. You know, that's part of some of this new funding that is going to be coming to lots of partners, including the Forest Service. And so emphasizing that this work that you two are, or you three, excuse me, that you three are doing in terms of like highlighting the need for where to take action plays into issues like tree equity. I think that's insightful. So thank you for sharing, Gary. Let me quick look. I'm trying to make sure I don't ignore anybody. Okay. I believe we covered the issues that Faith brought up. So thank you, Faith, for being persistent when I misunderstood your comment. Does anybody else have an item to bring up? I have one more question, but I don't want to run the whole show. So does anybody else have something that goes into chat? Do any of the speakers have a comment that has come to them? No? Okay. I have a question about commercial nurseries. You know, we talked about how state orchards and nurseries regrettably have been in the decline over the last decade or two. And some of that is because they're seen as competitive in sort of a negative light with private industry. But, you know, in some places it's factors outside that. Be that as it may, what's the role for commercial nurseries in this type of recovery, you know, potentially in this space? So can we, for instance, marry economic recovery and green jobs with tree breeding in a way that would be meaningful?
That's a difficult one. If we had a product, so let's say we had an ash with improved resistance and a private nursery, if it was, you know, something that could be deliverable through an open pollinated seed orchard, a private nursery, if they wanted to, could put up a seed orchard, collect the seed and sell it. And it wouldn't be any different than a state nursery doing that. The challenge though, with the commercial nurseries is that the money is not in little tiny seedlings. It's in big, big seedlings, like urban seedlings. And so the way to make money selling little tiny seedlings is to sell millions of them, which is why most of the commercial nurseries that sell forestry sell conifers, little tiny plugs, and they sell a zillion of them, and they make a lot of money doing it. They can make money doing that. They're not super profitable. Hardwoods are hard. They don't grow well in a little tiny pot, and they take up a lot of space in a bare root nursery bed. They're not as profitable. So it can be difficult. It's not a market that's amenable. Like it's growing hardwoods and growing improved hardwoods, especially when there aren't that many of them around. So there's this idea that it might take a while, like there's not a guarantee on the product. So if you sell an improved resistant hardwood, a commercial nursery sells it and it dies, you know, we said it's not going to be immune. They're not going to, people would come back, hey, you sold me a dead tree. It's like, well, they're not 100% resistant. So it's a hard product to sell. With a state nursery, a public nursery, a federal nursery, which would go in national forest land, be a little bit more of an understanding that we're going to sell you 20, you know, 8 may die, but you know, that's good. So they can play a role. And if we have a product that they could sell, and there was a market for it, they could definitely be part of this pipeline. But with hardwoods and uncertainty, and markets that aren't fully developed, commercial nurseries are not going to want to make the investments to jump into that market, you know, throw their investments into a facility and then fail. And so they're going to focus on urban trees with cultivars that they know what they look like. They can make them big, sell them for a lot of money.
Right. So the support of you know, a government-run system where part of the known system is the risk of failure is different than a commercial system.
Yes. And that's a role that state nurseries fit well because they can take risks that a private nursery that doesn't have the deep pockets of the corporate support, they can make risks that those private companies can't make. So if there was a good product, they could sell it. But these products, as you heard, there's a lot of uncertainty still.
And I'll add in the case of chestnut, you know, I think that there's, we work with a couple different types of nurseries. So the state nurseries are the easiest to work with, to Carrie's point. I 100% agree with that. We work with really small niche nurseries, native plant nurseries who, you know, specialize in finding these really hard to find species. So it's really interesting to me to work with colleagues in like landscape architecture and stuff. And they're like, I want to plant native species, but I can't find them. So like hickory and all this stuff, like if they want to design a planting that's native, it's really hard for them to find these types of species. Exactly to Carrie's point, they're not profitable and they're hard to grow and they're expensive to grow. But then we work with other nurseries I won't name any names, but there are huge outfits that when we say, hey, do you want to grow some chestnut for us? Awesome. Send me 10,000 seed minimum. And we're like, that's my entire harvest. Like,
It's all volume. Their sales are all volume.
It's total volume. And so, for us, when I'm looking at $1 million, $2 million, I mean, the biggest harvest we've ever had is 150,000 seed. And that's 1 year out of the 20 years that I've been here. And, this past year we were at, I think, 80,000. So that's a lot to me, but like to get it to that $1 million, $2 million, like that's what it's going to take. So we have to have, to Carrie's point, we have to have something that ain't going to die, and we got to have a ton of them. And to get to that threshold, I mean, we're almost there with chestnut. We're not going to be there for another 10 years to like get to that volume. But these other species that are just beginning these programs, I mean, it's going to be a long, long road, and it's going to take so many resources and money and people and partnerships to make it. Hopefully they'll be able to do it faster than we did with chestnut, because we had a lot of pitfalls along the way.
You guys were the pioneers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We all learn from the past, and sometimes that's learning from mistakes, and sometimes that's learning from progress. But nonetheless, we're all standing on each other's progress in the best of possible ways, because otherwise you can't get there anymore. You know? So yes, absolutely. So question. So Faith Campbell would like you to be taken off mute. So that would be great. Thank you, Laurel, for doing the tech. Faith, I wasn't sure what your question was, but we'll, Margaret Allen, we will get to your question once Faith is done with her, what she wanted to talk about.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Going back to the issue of whether people think it's impossible. I am not in that school. I want to do it. So don't.
Thank you for clarifying.
But there are people in the Forest Service, people with a lot of influence in the Forest Service. People look to as leaders on invasive species. And if you want to know exactly who I mean, you can email me, who say it's impossible for all the reasons that we've been discussing, including the issue of prolific growth of non-resistant elms, ash, et cetera, and so forth out there in the woods. And the reason I raise this is because the dialogue is not a tree planting organization. It's supposed to work on policy. And I think that the dialogue should be thinking about how to get around this skepticism. And what allies we might find, what people we might motivate to speak up. Anyway, all the politics of getting around this skepticism so that we can maybe create programs of sufficient size and scope that will have enough seedlings to put out there to have a running chance at getting resistant trees in the landscape. And the same way with the invasive plants. If they are as great an impediment to regeneration of our trees, as they say, and I have no doubt about that, then we need to reinvigorate the kinds of policy efforts there are to get control over invasive plants, including the nursery trade role in it, the way they continue to bring in and spread around invasive plants. So that's where I was trying to go with this. There are some real policy challenges out there that I hope will become part of the dialogues, thinking about strategies and priorities. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us back around on that, Faith, because you bring up a good point. A big point of this webinar is to figure out how to inform future strategies. So making sure that we think strategically, so that informs our strategic planning for the future. In terms of, Faith, I just took notes, who are the allies to these types of programs, and who are the skeptics that we have to, address head on in terms of both policy and implementation. Because I agree with all of you. We could do this. if we had the resources and the motivations. I don't think it's impossible. I just think it's hard. And also I think we all acknowledge it's very expensive and it's going to take a long time. But we do lots of hard, expensive things over long periods of time in our lives. That's okay. If they're important, we should do them. So, actually, I'm going to disagree with Margaret herself. She asks, could we promote small farm grants for smallholders? And then she said it's not a good idea, but I actually think that's an interesting idea, because if the problem is the guarantee of financial stability, and that's holding us back from using private partnerships, then perhaps private partnerships could be a productive use. So I'm curious, Carrie and Sarah, is there any type of sort of public-private partnership to guarantee against losses, or at least buffer against losses that in the nursery field? Is that a thing? I'm just curious about that because it's an interesting concept.
Don't know about it with the commercial nurseries. I don't think there is. They just have their own insurance and have their own clientele that they need to please. NRCS is working with private landowners, though, to help them, to give them, they can get funds to support tree planting on their property, which includes investments in fencing and whatever they need to do. So NRCS has worked with private landowners. As far as the commercial nurseries, they don't like to be told what to do or how to do things. So, yeah, and they don't get federal grants. So they have to kind of work that out with their customers.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I don't know if Sarah had anything else to add to that.
I don't. I mean, NRCS is going to be a really important partner, especially in terms of getting to work with private forest landowners and bracing ourselves for failure because it's going to happen not just at the nursery level, but once they go out. I mean, the trees die for just a phenomenal amount of reasons. But I really like Kate. I'm sure you'll bring it up, Lee, but Katie's message in here about the planning and the timing of funding and all of that. I mean, that just add on all the issues that we have to deal with these kinds of programs.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't see the chat box, so Katie adds, to add to the challenge of purchasing native seedlings, native tree seedlings at scale, we run into the issue of mismatched timing of funding availability and the availability of the species that we need. So nurseries need to plan several years in advance, but we don't know if we have the funds until 6 months in advance of planning. And I've seen this in real time. I had some people asking me, when are chestnut seedlings going to be available to plant onto Nature Conservancy lands? Just conceptually, people were curious. And I said, I believe it's not going to be another few years out. And they said, yeah, but we need to know so we can write those grants now. And I was like, I got no surety for you of my answer. But that's the reality, is that if they think they can try to put out test plots in 3 years, they have to write the grant now for something that doesn't have approval from the EPA. It gets very Byzantine very rapidly.
And that's the other niche that the state nurseries fill. They can sell speculatively. So you can buy them, we're having a spring sale and you can go buy them if they're available. But like a lot of these commercial wholesale nurseries, they only sell to like a state, for example, and they have to order 2 years in advance. So they have to have their developed forest planning done a couple of years in advance. They put in the orders and they're on the hook for those seedlings, whether they need them or not. So that's another niche that the state nurseries provide, is being able to sell their material speculatively to private landowners. Yes. And there aren't many nurseries that do that.
Right. Excellent. Thank you for that. So Laurel Downs with the Nature Conservancy asks, have there been any experiments on breeding invasive plant pests to make them more vulnerable to the natural pathogens and native species defenses? And Laurel, I don't 100% understand your question. Can you take yourself off mute and just clarify it a little bit?
Yeah, so I was just curious, you guys were talking a lot about how, invasive plants are a big challenge for, breeding all these native hardwoods. And so I was just wondering, with all the work that's going into this, like molecular genetics and everything else with the native stuff, has there been any similar experiments for the invasive plants to try to make them less resilient to our native defenses of the stuff we already have here? So kind of like the opposite of what you're trying to do with the native stuff.
Yeah,
I haven't heard of that at all. I think we're just, I haven't heard of that. Yeah, maybe we can breed them to be less obnoxious.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sorry.
I was
I
gonna
was
say,
gonna-
you know, we have seen that type, sorry, I keep talking over you, Sarah. I'll finish up in a second. We have seen that type of tactic a couple times now with gene drive in certain other invasive species spaces. So there's aquatic mussels, they're attempting to do that right now. Mice, I think, and certainly mosquitoes. And so that is, it's not an insane idea by any means. We're definitely trying to do it for key pests that can be genetically modified to reduce their own populations. But I have never heard of it for terrestrial weeds.
Yeah, and not necessarily breeding. I mean, that's interesting though, like breeding susceptibility in, is sort of a novel concept. But I mean, there certainly are examples like Ailanthus, there's a fusarium that just sort of naturally started affecting them and vascular wilts and things like that. And then luckily someone brought in spotted lanternfly and that attacks Ailanthus. But I'm joking, that's not a good thing at all. But I mean, I think there are examples where, we can control these. I think gene drive is such a phenomenal and interesting concept. I have not heard it applied to plants. I don't know how that would work, but breeding susceptibility, and that's something I haven't thought about before. And I think, if we look at like transgenics too, that there might be a possibility, there. Traditional breeding might be a stretch. Who wants to plant a bunch of invasive species and select for susceptibility? I don't know. That'd be a hard sell for a tree breeder, I think.
Yeah, and you would definitely have to do it in an area that was already overwhelmed with that invasive plant, or else you're, creating a whole new risk to your new area. So it would definitely have to be very heavily regulated.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, these technologies like gene drive are, they're so deeply risky because of how they work. And that doesn't mean they're not a valid way to approach projects and issues, but goodness, in particular, even much, much more so than the types of genetic technologies that Sarah's working with chestnut, those technologies, because of their self-perpetuation, are just, there have to be a lot of fail-safes in place before you can really engage in that. So, all right, let's totally change the topic to Karen Lombard's statement of we need a volunteer seeding care corps. And I agree. And I wonder how much we have an opening right now with the, National Conversation on Climate Corps to approach that and to have that conversation of, how much hardwood restoration, which would include, improved seedlings of the type that we've been talking about today, actually can be part of the Climate Corps conversation. So I see Erin frantically taking notes on this because this is the exact sort of thing that I know she likes to bring up when she speaks to lawmakers.
And I have one in mind who I have to talk to about something else. So I'm like, oh, let me just add this to my agenda for the next meeting.
I mean, fantastic. That's why we're here. So it's a great idea. So thank you, Karen, for bringing that up of the federal corps of all sorts can be really productive here in a conservation spaces. So Gary Fish is continuing the conversation on invasive weeds. Yes, that's a complex space that's a little bit outside the typical realm of the invasive forest pest space, but of course they're so intertwined in so many ways that you kind of conversation drifts around with that. Let me just take a look, see, we don't have any other Q&A questions coming up. Does anybody else? We've been trying to not actually take until 5 o'clock Eastern time with these presentations unless strictly necessary. So I'm just going to say, does anybody else have a topic or question for Carrie or Sarah or Katie to address before we start to wind this down? Gary Fish says, thank you, which I agree. Thank you all for your great presentations. We have had some folks following up after these presentations for requests for the points. And I just want to reiterate, we are going to be posting all the PowerPoints and all of the recordings to the Continental Dialogue's website, which is continentalforestdialogue.org after we're done. Some of them will be posted faster than others because of permissions and file modifications and so forth, but they certainly should all be available by the end of the calendar year, unless something very unexpected happens. So certainly you can come back to it in January anew. Just checking. Well, we've got fewer participants than we started and no additional questions. So thank you all so much for your participation, for your presentations, to all of our speakers, to everybody who contributed over the last 4 webinars.
Thanks, Lee, and everybody
Thanks,
for bringing
Lee.
this together. It was great to see Katie and Carrie again, and happy
Yeah,
holidays.
you as well, Sarah.
Thank you
Yeah.
guys. You've all made me feel better about my own gardening and landscaping efforts through this webinar today too. So
That's right. So for everybody who's ever had a plant die, you know you're in great company now.
Right.
yeah, I've got a survival rate of about 2/3. So.
That's great.
That's okay. I had a green ash in my yard that died, and I have a Bradford pear that I wish to die but won't die. So
I have one that's slowly hanging on, and the tree health person was like, it's still okay. I'm like, really? Doesn't look.
Okay, well, everybody cut down your Bradford pears, and thank you for attending this webinar. We are officially adjourned.
all right.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.